Welcome back to Matter of Fact. I'm here today with Florence Gaub. She heads the research division at the NATO Defense College in Rome. She's a political scientist specializing in foresight, and she's also a keynote speaker, which is how we met. I was lucky to hear one of her keynotes a few months ago, and your book, Florence, The Future, A User's Guide, came out in April of 2026. It covers how we perceive or sometimes don't perceive the future and what that means for our personal lives, but also for how we govern and organize society. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Damita.
So, because this is really a podcast about politics and policy, I'd like to relate the topic of your book mostly to how we govern ourselves. And one of the things you say in the book is that European leaders are currently missing this positive vision. And this is something that I've heard in many conversations I've moderated this year, that Europe really lacks a common vision. And we can compare it to, as you write, Saudi Arabia, which has its Vision 2030, to China, which has its Vision 2049, which is the centenary of the People's Republic of China. And then you write that European leadership lacks that because they seem to be mostly busy avoiding negative futures. Paint me a picture. What would be the positive vision of a European future that you would like to see European leaders advance?
I think part of the problem is what I would call a luxury problem, in the sense that we have achieved a lot of the positive visions we had in the past, right? So I'm not saying everything is great and we have nothing to improve on, but we used to have a lot of pretty common positive futures for Europe, such as decreasing child mortality in general, improving healthcare, improving life expectancy, improving working conditions, material growth, and all that. And so we have achieved quite a lot. If you look back at the last 100 years, or if you want even 200 years, it's insane how far Europe has come. But that also creates, when you're on top of the mountain, where do you go next? And that creates a bit of a problem for, okay, now we have achieved a lot of these, what should we look at next? And I think this is the void everybody is feeling. There's a few other factors that play a role, short-termism and so forth. But I think if I had to sketch it out, I would say, first of all, we are lacking a positive concept for a society in which a larger portion, about a third of people, will be over 60. It's the side effect or the consequence of increasing life expectancy, which was a positive policy objective. So we need to figure out how that the last part of life, how that is a productive part, a happy part of human life, and not just seen as sitting around waiting for death. So I think that is one thing. The other thing is, of course, how we relate to the environment and animals. Thanks to AI, we will probably be able to communicate in some form or another, at least with mammals, in 50 to 100 years. I'm pretty sure of that. We have first signs for that. When I ask people how they feel about that, only half of people think that's a good thing. I think they're worried that they can't eat eggs or chicken or beef or whatever anymore if suddenly these animals tell them, actually, we don't like that. But I think overall, if you want to sketch out a few utopian dimensions, living in harmony with a planet that is as age-old as utopia itself. And then lastly, I think we also hit right now with a changing economic model, also thanks to AI and robotics and so forth. We come to the ultimate question, like, what does it mean to be human when a lot of the work can be done by machines? And this is an age-old question. Keynes and others, they were worried that, okay, what is a human identity without work? What kind of work do we want to do? And I think there's a lot of questions that need to be answered and that we can formulate a positive vision for. And we are not doing it. At the moment, there's just a lot of fear of change, and not seizing this opportunity as something that we can mold and influence, and more seeing it, being very defensive about everything. Let's keep everything as it is. So I think if you take these three together, work, but also work-life, human and the environment, and then also human health, like our bodies and all that, I think you have a lot of elements for positive vision.
Quite a lot there, and yet I think we see time and again how European leaders are very focused on avoiding negative futures. And one place that I thought I saw that was the NATO Summit just now that just ended. I really want to get your thoughts on this, because I'm thinking particularly, for example, of Mark Rutte sitting there and saying nothing, watching Trump bash allies, watching Trump sort of reiterate his threats against Greenland. But I'm also thinking of the very strong focus on expenditure numbers with less talk of a positive vision of how to spend that money, how this will translate into real military capabilities. But also, again, this placating of Donald Trump, it seems that a lot of this was, again, aimed at avoiding possible negative futures rather than building a shared positive one. And I'm wondering what your thoughts were watching the summit play out.
So I think the first thing that's important to understand is that NATO is, of course, it's an avoiding negative future organization, right? Like NATO is about avoiding war, and when it does, should it happen, then it wants to win it. But it's NATO in itself, even though the treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty, also talks about economic prosperity, shared values and all that. I think it's mostly about, let's say, a defensive future. And of course, the summit was very much focused, continues to be very much focused on allied cohesion, keep the Americans in, get everybody else on the same level. What I find a bit sad is that, of course, it's normal that Donald Trump captures a lot of the public imagination and attention, but there's also a lot of other things happening. Yes, we have all this investment in defense that creates also jobs. It creates more security, which then helps stabilize the economy, because the economy, people don't invest when they think there's a war around the corner. So I'm not saying, you could spin this in a positive way, because ultimately the best case scenario would be that we get along with Russia and we don't have to be afraid of it. That's the best case scenario. Unfortunately, at the moment, that's not within reach. What's the second best case scenario is, that we deter Russia from doing anything stupid and that we actually continue to live in peace. But even within that story, you're right, there's plenty of, I think, very interesting stories. And I was just on a podcast the other week, and I mentioned that cohesion on defense spending, to me, is one of the good things that I saw this year so far. And my interlocutor said, well, isn't it rather bad news that we have to spend so much on defense? Well, yes, but it would be even worse if we didn't have consensus that this is what we have to do. So I think this is definitely not an easy time. But, when people say, you cannot have a utopia right now because these are difficult times. Well, utopias are born in difficult times, Utopias are not born when everything's going smoothly. It's precisely when you feel the pain that you understand, okay, this I want to be different in the future. So from that point of view, I think the summit, at least from within NATO, it is read as actually it went rather well, in that we had you mentioned Greenland, but Trump also said he wouldn't do anything. He managed to simultaneously threaten and encourage allies. What I've seen also is that behind the scenes, outside the press, mood was rather good, actually. So I think, is it great? No, but it's clearly not as bad as some people think it is.
You mentioned how Donald Trump captures a lot of attention. Do you think that part of the problem in Europe and part of the reason we lack this alternative positive vision is that we tend to define ourselves quite strongly in relation to the US, in relation to other players, in relation to China, but not so much in terms of what we stand for as Europe?
100%. I think, I don't know if that's historical, maybe it's also an international phenomenon, but we definitely, as Europeans, who used to hold, the flag for the future. I mean, most utopian ideas for the future came from Europe at some point, the French Revolution, but even after that. So I think definitely, depends on the country, but definitely the Western Europeans, Germany, I would also argue Austria, the UK for sure, even Italy, definitely defined their future via the United States. Like the transatlantic relationship gives the cover, gives the protection, but also kind of discourages independent thinking, I would argue. And I'm talking outside defense now. But then there's also perhaps what I mentioned, the fact that Europe's old ideas have been mostly achieved, and now what do we do next? And of course, lastly, I think the invasion of Ukraine dashed typical European utopian ideals. After 1990, this was actually the summit, this was the apex of European utopia, End of the Cold War, not a single bullet was fired. Now we go on and grow, prosper, and be all friends. And so we had our utopia for a time, and I think maybe now we have a utopian hangover, a European utopian hangover, and we need to get back into gear to develop a new one. But definitely the United States has played a role, and of course the United States has its own future crisis ongoing that is not identical to the European one, but it's similar. So I think we are in the same boat, and we all need to fix the problem in our own way.
It's interesting that you mentioned the 90s, because something else that you say in the book is you argue that humans have always been pessimistic about the future, that it's not really anything new. The current moment in time is not unique in history. Yet, as someone who grew up in the 90s, I do seem to remember this time of, the end of history. We were going to bring about peace through universal democracy, through universal capitalism. Talk me through that argument.
So, first of all, there is a phenomenon called nostalgia. Really what nostalgia is isn't just a feeling, it's a neurological trick So your brain deletes bad memories. And that is, if I ask you now, what was bad in the 90s, you would probably struggle to remember anything concretely and it does that on the personal level as much as on the geopolitical level, right? And that's probably a good thing for humans, There's a phenomenon that we just don't remember a lot of the negative stuff. So we do not recall easily the genocide in Rwanda, the Balkan Wars, the fact that right after the 1990s, at least in Germany, there was a huge economic crisis. Also in the US, then there was inflation, we had the rise of terrorism, people were afraid of something else. And I think perhaps that's like a displacement bias that you think of, okay, now I'm afraid of global war, you think back to the past, you think, well, I wasn't afraid of that then, so surely it was a better time. But then you were afraid, Samuel Huntington, you were afraid of ethnic conflict, of perhaps, genocide making a comeback, which was terrible. Both Rwanda and Srebrenica raised the real fear that after the Holocaust, the Holocaust was until that moment seen as a one-time event, and then Srebrenica and Rwanda suddenly gave the impression, okay, maybe this was not a one-time event, maybe humans can continue to try and eliminate a whole other people. So I think, I don't want to dismiss what people feel right now. In fact, on the contrary, I think looking into history and realizing that things can be good and things can be bad at the same time. And just as today, we solved several of the problems of the 90s, now we have a new set of problems. We can solve the problems of today and then face new problems in the future.
Do you not see anything that is unique about the current moment in history with AI, with the massive technological changes, with climate change? Is your argument really saying that, look, this is just sort of the normal continuation?
No, I'm saying that every moment in history is unique and that every moment has its own challenges. And of course, we always say history is repeating or history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. There are elements that resemble the past and others that don't. But I also think that we're not helping ourselves if we claim that this is unique and therefore has never been managed. I think every moment in history is unique and every time humanity has found some type of solution or didn't, but humans are very ingenious actually. And I'll give you one concrete example. In the late 60s, appeared this book by Paul Ehrlich, The Population Bomb. And so today we have totally forgotten about that, but there was a real panic that by the 1990s, human demographic growth would have outpaced agricultural production and humans would die on a very large scale from famines. So we have forgotten that. You know why? Because it never happened. And you know why it didn't happen is not because he was wrong, he was partly wrong, but mostly because human beings found solutions and managed to increase efficiency of agriculture. Of course, human and also population growth didn't happen as fast as Paul Ehrlich thought, but ultimately it was humans changing the course of events. And I think this is a very empowering story that we managed to avoid this dystopian future that Paul Ehrlich painted precisely because we got into gear. And this is exactly my call to action. Let's stop admiring the problem. Let's move into solving the problem. And I think I always say, as long as you know what you're supposed to be doing, it's not actually a problem. It's a problem when you don't even have a solution for it.
Let's talk about how we solve it. So one of the consequences of this uncertain age that we live in, I think, is that people have grown more and more discontented with democracy. And one of the reasons for that is that there is this argument that autocracies are better at long-term thinking, at long-term planning, because the regime is more stable, because there isn't a change every 4 to 5 years, and there's little change in leadership, so that makes things easier. In your book, you advance the idea of long-termist democracies as the best governance model. So a model that is democratic, but rather than simply focusing on the next electoral cycle, it would work on a longer-term vision. Talk me through what that might look like, and especially how do we change the incentive structure of our system so that the strongest incentive is no longer getting reelected in 5 years, but that it becomes actually building a better future 10 or 20 years from now?
So I think you saw also in the book, I quote a study that shows that citizens in democracies want their governments to think long term. So I think you can also make the case that if you do think long term and you explain it to your population well, then that you can get elected also on that. I mean, I know that right now the way it's packaged, and you know, let's say climate change as an example, and you tell people, okay, vote for me to avoid the worst case scenario, that to me is not a positive future, right? So I think first of all, citizens in democracies are intelligent and they understand that long-termism is good. The second thing is there's a study that compared democracies and autocracies in terms of future orientation, and it found that the key distinction is not whether you're an autocracy or a democracy, is whether you think long-term. And of course, a long-term thinking democracy is the best model suited for the future. But of course, comes second is a long-term thinking dictatorship, and then comes a short-termist democracy. So democracies have to be distinguished between short and long-termist. And there we see a real difference. We do see that countries like Finland, Costa Rica, they outperform when it comes to future fitness. You can measure future readiness, preparedness, crisis, etc. Crisis preparedness, they do have that advantage. Now, the problem that we have is that not every democracy has the institutions, the structures, let's say even the culture, to think automatically about the future. And this is one of my hobby horses, is to drive home the point that every single democracy, democracy is per se a future-oriented enterprise. Because in contrast to dictatorship, democracy makes the promise there will be elections. I can't tell you the future, but I can promise you in 4 or 5 years, depending on where you live, there will be elections. A dictatorship never does that. So when you look at Finland, where you have a parliamentary committee on the future, you have a future report that is issued before every major election, you have in every ministry a future foresight advisor whose role it is to liaise to the other ministries to see, okay, what future are you working on, etc., etc. I mean, I'm not saying every country should be exactly like Finland. We see other countries like Spain, for instance, they have a slightly different model. Here you have in the Prime Minister's office a little think tank that's future-oriented, and that did a huge participatory study, España 2050, with a Spanish population. So, long story short, there is a way that democracies can be future-oriented, but there's a big but, they have to commit to it. And the way to commit to it is to create the necessary institutions for it. And here I see countries such as Germany, such as the UK, I would even argue to some extent the US. The US used to be better at this, just letting it fall by the wayside. And I think part of it is I would say, almost philosophical crisis we already touched on, is not seeing the positive future. Then there are fears for electoral defeat, thinking if I run in elections with a future that people are afraid of, I will not win. So I think this is part of a larger epistemic crisis, an expression of a larger epistemic crisis, trying to fix the present and thinking the future has to wait. Well, actually, I'm convinced that the present crisis is part of dodging that future. And here the studies are very clear. The more afraid a citizen is of the future, the more he or she will vote populist. In Germany, it's AfD or Die Linke. In France, it's Rassemblement National. In Italy, it's Lega Nord. So dodging the future means you feed the populists because they have a certainty concerning the future that you don't have. And so I think, to me, this is a future crisis, actually.
And is the key to building a more long-termist democracy creating the according institutions? In other words, if Germany tomorrow decided it was going to have a ministry for the future and dedicated task forces and groups, would people stop voting AfD, or would the country automatically become more long-termist and future-oriented?
I wouldn't say automatically, but I think it would pave the way, because ultimately the future is a discussion space, right? It's a space where you and I and everybody else brings what they feel about the future, what they want from it, what they don't want from it, their hopes, their fears, and all that. So the only way to generate a discussion at the collective level, at the societal level, is from the government or for political parties. But it's never the private sector. It's certainly never just the citizens alone. So that's why we have governments and democracies. And so if the government has an institution, has the necessary structures, I think they have a basis for discussion to go on. I think a report alone will not create that basis for discussion. Then they would have to go out and actually seek interaction with the citizens. And again, this is, I think, I always say, why does nobody do replication of España 2050? The way Sanchez's government did it, they went through Spain, they traveled around Spain, they did interviews with civil society representatives, private sector, companies, NGOs, what have you. Then they wrote a report and they asked them, what kind of Spain do you want for the future? What kind of Spain do you want to end up in 2050? They wrote the report and then they traveled again around the country to discuss the findings. So is that easy? No. Is it painful? Absolutely. But there is no way around it. And I think this is the discussion that people are afraid of. Maybe there's also a lot of effort and they don't necessarily see the benefits. But I think if I had one wish, it would be replicate España 2050 in your country. And I think then you have a better chance at defeating populists than with everything else.
I think participation in those societal processes also requires a level of engagement and a level of hope. And I think that many people are currently not feeling that level of engagement because they're simply the whole topic of news avoidance, the whole topic of simply not following what's going on anymore because it's too overwhelming, right? A lot of people are simply disengaging because there's a lot of uncertainty and our brains really don't like uncertainty. Do you have any thoughts on what we can do as individuals to become more comfortable with the thought of an uncertain future and with remaining engaged even among the uncertainty?
So, strangely enough, uncertainty, the extent to which your brain can tolerate uncertainty has also to do with how it's structured, and we have neurological differences, right? So some people by nature will be more tolerant to uncertainty than others. So I think maybe this also helps some people understand, well, it's not your fault, you're not doing anything wrong, it's just your brain stresses out faster than others. But then the other is habituation. The easiest way to get used to handle uncertainty is to get used to it. And I'll give you one example. I live in Italy, and I had this insight a few years ago. I saw a study, a presentation that compared German and Italian tolerance to uncertainty. So, of course, the Germans are very intolerant to uncertainty, and the Italians are very tolerant. And the graphic showed both levels of tolerance or intolerance during major crises. And you could see that the Italians, through the financial crisis, September 11, the Arab Spring, they remained cool as cucumber, and then the only thing that slightly unsettled them was the pandemic. And the Germans had huge rates, they were stressed out about everything. And I found that interesting, and I asked my Italian colleagues, how do you explain that? And they said, well, we know that we cannot rely on the Italian state so much. The infrastructure is not great, the system doesn't work so well, income isn't so great, but we are used to fixing problems on our own. We find ways to fix our own problems. And then, so what it boils down to is agency. So when you learn that I can fix this or have fixed problems in the past, you become more self-confident, and then you look at uncertainty in a completely different way because I have fixed other issues, I can also fix whatever comes next. And I think this is where German need for certainty has made them intolerant to uncertainty. You saw it with a crisis with the public train system, which is in complete shambles. And every time a train comes late, a German has a nervous breakdown. Funnily enough, in Italy, the trains run on time. But I think what it boils down to is the more you try to fix uncertainty by creating certainty, the more allergic you become to uncertainty. So I would say you don't have to start big, but try going out, leave the house without your phone and go around the block and see what it does to feel not knowing exactly. I have my little device with me that helps me at all times, or switch off the GPS, take the road to work that you've never taken, get lost on purpose. I think these are small things you can do, and of course you can extend it, and of course do it within reason. Don't be stupid about it. But I do think the 21st century, thanks to the iPhone, thanks to the internet, has made us a bit more intolerant.
This is something else that you write about and that has come up, I think, in every podcast episode that I've recorded so far. The topic of how social media, the algorithms, our information space is making us less apt at dealing with the world that we are facing. Do you have any thoughts on how we might solve that?
Yeah. So I think it's very important that your brain continues to be exposed to very diverse information. Because you know what your brain is trying to do? Your brain tries to build a predictive model of the world. Humans are all dislike uncertainty. You can be more tolerant to it, but we all dislike it. And so your brain will gather all of information and build a predictive model that tries to assess what's going to happen next. So the best way to have a very complete model of the world is to have information that completely contradicts what you used to think. And that's why the more you are in your own bubble and you hear the same things over and over about what the world is like, the more you're going to be shocked when you discover actually my neighbor thinks something completely different. So I give you one example of what I do. I watch Fox News, or I go on Fox News, the website. Clearly, I'm not American and I'm not Republican leaning, but I find it interesting to see. And the more I watch it, the less it's scary. I mean, it's certainly surprising every single time, but it becomes less scary. So I would say seek out information that you naturally wouldn't read or watch. Again, within reason, you don't have to go, complete radical, but for many of us, it's just on the other side of the political aisle. If you are a conservative, why don't you pick up a Green Party publication, or the other way around? Just engage with the idea. I think everybody's so busy rushing to an opinion. Don't have to try and have an opinion immediately. Just look at the information and see, this is interesting. Somebody sees it this way. And it might make you feel a little uncomfortable in the beginning, but I think it will ultimately help you have a fuller coverage of what the world is actually like.
And it will likely develop your empathy as well, right? Because you
True.
learn to relate to neighbors and acquaintances who might think differently, and you learn to maybe...
100%. Yeah.
The final thing I want to talk to you about, Florence, is you look at the mid-range future in your work. Your job is to look ahead 2 to 5 years and try to figure out what the world might look like. Give me some scenarios. Give me maybe a best case scenario and a worst case scenario of where you think Europe is going to be in 2030.
I think a reality will be that in 2030, Donald Trump will no longer be president of the United States. Some people find that hard to imagine, but I think it's definitely going to be the case. What I do hope is that whoever is in the White House, that the Europeans do not stop spending on defense or increasing their own. You know, for me, this isn't just about defense. It's what Macron calls strategic sovereignty. To conceive of yourself as a continent, as a group of countries that together stand in this world and have a certain way of looking at things. And we have a right to be on this planet, just like everybody else. I feel like Europeans sometimes we're very sorry for being here and for colonial past and all that, and that's fair. But I also think that if we look at the future where you have more voices from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, I think that's great. But I also think also Europeans have something to add. So I think that's the one thing. That would be, for me, worst case scenario would be if Europe just put the brakes on if we have a Democrat president in the White House. So I think the best case is we continue to be ourselves, and of course that we continue to have good relations with the United States. The worst case scenario, of course, is a war with Russia, but I also don't think it's the most likely scenario by 2030. I think Russia is not keen on war either. I think if we build a credible deterrence and defense, that will not happen. I want for Ukraine the war to be over, but I'm afraid, and that's the worst case, is that we'll have a low-level conflict in Ukraine that will continue. You know, it doesn't have to be very lethal, it doesn't have to be very intense, but it will stop Ukraine from being a stable democracy and prospering market economy. And then I also think by 2030 we'll have a clear idea of where China is heading in defense and foreign policy. Because I know at the moment, you know, I mean, this term China is rising, it's been around since the 90s. I mean, I was like, okay, where is it rising to? It's been rising and rising. It's pretty long ascent. But by 2030, you know, China is shrinking in population terms. That is a result of its one-child policy. It put an end to the one-child policy a few years ago. But interestingly, I don't know if you know this, but while states have succeeded in curbing fertility rates, no state in the world has managed to do the reverse. So you can stop women from having children, but when they don't want to have children, you clearly cannot force them to. And so this is a reality that China is facing, which will have implications for the economy, but I also think for its foreign and defense posture. So I think China is definitely on an interesting journey to watch. I don't want to call it best or worst case, but I'm not sure China is heading towards some kind of future where it will dominate the world. I don't think it's going to be in that position. And then, of course, I want to end on AI. I think by 2030 we will have regulated, and by we I mean at least the Western states, but I'm also sure China will have regulated AI in the sense that what do we want it to be able to do and what do we not want it to be able to do. Because this is, I feel like in this discussion on AI, it sounds like the ship has sailed, there's nothing we can do, super AI is coming and it's killing all of us. Not true. We can still regulate it, and in fact, you know, I was just in San Francisco for an exchange with leaders from AI companies, and they said, we want to be regulated. We want you to tell us what should we not be doing with this, but they can't do it by themselves. And I think, you know, stop complaining, just move into action and start regulating. That's what states do, and that's what they should be doing here.
You talked about agency earlier, and it sounds like the two decisions where we have the biggest agency to influence a positive future is one, to not start slacking on European defense, even if a more Europe-friendly president takes the White House next. And number two, to make sure that we stay on top of AI governance and to regulate it.
100%. Yeah,
awesome.
That's right.
Thank you so much for being here with us on Matter of Fact today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Damita.
Thank you for listening, and see you next time.